Imagine, it's 1985, and the AIDS crisis is gripping the nation. The fear is palpable, the silence deafening. You turn on the TV expecting leadership, expecting answers, but all you hear is, well, nothing. Because it took 6 long years for President Reagan to even publicly acknowledge AIDS. By that time, nearly 47,000 Americans had already been infected with HIV or died from AIDS.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The weight of that silence, the lives lost. While those in power stayed silent, it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the stigma surrounding AIDS at the time and how fear can paralyze even the most powerful people.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how did ordinary people cope with that fear and misinformation? What did it take to show compassion and to take action when it felt like the world was turning its back?
Well, that's what we're diving into today. The stories of 2 individuals who chose courage and compassion when it would have been easier, much easier, to look away. 2 very different contexts, 2 very different struggles, but a shared thread of resilience and the power of the human spirit.
Okay, so let's start with Medgar Evers. We're talking about Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s, the heart of the Jim Crow South. Now, most of us have heard about, the segregated schools, the buses, but what we're going to uncover today is the psychological impact of living under Jim Crow. This wasn't just about separate water fountains. It was about a system designed to strip Black people of their dignity and their humanity. Absolutely.
To truly understand Medgar Evers' fight, we have to understand the world that he was fighting against. Imagine a world where every day, every single day, you are bombarded with messages that you are less than, that you don't deserve the same rights and opportunities as others.
And our sources reveal that Medgar Evers experienced this firsthand, even as a child. When he was just 14 years old, he witnessed a friend of his father's being lynched. Imagine the trauma of seeing that kind of hate at such a young age.
Heartbreaking. Lynching wasn't just murder. It was a public spectacle designed to terrorize Black communities. Groups like the White Citizens Council and the Ku Klux Klan used violence and intimidation to enforce their vision of white supremacy.
And it's amazing that despite witnessing this horrific act, Medgar Evers didn't succumb to fear or hatred. Instead, he channeled that experience into a lifelong fight for equality.
Right. He refused to be defined by the limitations imposed upon him. He served in a segregated battalion during World War II, only to come back home to face the same discrimination. He was denied entry to the University of Mississippi Law School solely because of his race, even though he was a qualified veteran.
It's incredible how he kept pushing forward. He became deeply involved with the NAACP, investigating hate crimes and working to register Black voters. This was incredibly dangerous work, especially in Mississippi. Can you imagine the courage it took to stand up to those who wanted to silence him?
Well, think about what was at stake. The right to vote is fundamental to a democracy. And Black people were being systematically denied that right through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence. Medgar Evers knew that registering voters was a key step towards dismantling the system of oppression that kept Black people marginalized.
And his work didn't go unnoticed. He and his family faced constant threats and harassment. His wife, Merle, she talks about firebombs being thrown at their house, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, their children growing up under the shadow of fear.
It's a reminder that this fight wasn't abstract, it wasn't theoretical for them, it was their daily reality, a constant struggle for survival and a relentless fight for their basic human rights.
And tragically, that fight ultimately cost Medgar his life. In 1963, he was assassinated in his own driveway, right in front of his children.
This was a turning point in the civil rights movement. The image of a civil rights leader, gunned down in cold blood, shocked the nation and galvanized the movement for racial justice.
The killer, a white supremacist named Byron De La Beckwith, was finally brought to justice decades later, thanks in large part to the tireless efforts of Merle Evers Williams. She refused to let her husband's case fade away, even when 2 all-white juries failed to convict De La Beckwith.
It's a testament to her strength. And perseverance. Her refusal to let injustice prevail. She understood that true justice goes beyond punishment. It requires accountability, acknowledgement, and a commitment to dismantling the systems that perpetuate inequality. And his story, it's a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is often a marathon, not a sprint. It takes resilience, determination, and a refusal to accept the status quo.
It's truly inspiring. Now, shifting gears to our second story, let's travel to San Francisco in the early 1980s, where a different kind of crisis was unfolding, the AIDS epidemic. And much like the Jim Crow South, this was time marked by fear, misinformation, and a chilling silence from those in power.
Exactly. The early years of the AIDS crisis were shrouded in fear and stigma. There was so much unknown about the disease. And this lack of knowledge, well, it fueled prejudice and discrimination.
Our sources paint a stark picture of the social and political climate at the time. AIDS was primarily associated with gay men, and this association led to widespread homophobia and discrimination. People were losing their jobs, being evicted from their homes, facing social ostracism just because they were suspected of having AIDS.
And the media wasn't helping. Sensationalized headlines, fear-mongering tactics, it only served to exacerbate the panic. Insurance companies used pre-existing conditions clauses to deny coverage to those with AIDS, leaving many, many without access to life-saving treatments.
It was a truly dark time, and those living with AIDS were often treated as pariahs. Now, in the midst of all of this, we have Cliff Morrison, a gay nurse who witnessed the horrors of this epidemic firsthand.
Yes. Morrison saw how fear and prejudice were impacting patient care. People with AIDS were being isolated, neglected, and even denied basic medical treatment.
And he had a deeply personal experience with this. Morrison's roommate, Wayne, was dying from AIDS-related complications, and he witnessed the dehumanizing treatment Wayne received in hospitals. It was a wake-up call for him.
Right.
A stark realization of the urgent need for compassionate and dignified care for those living with AIDS.
Absolutely. And that experience ignited a fire in Morrison. He knew he had to do something to change the way AIDS patients were being treated.
So he took on the monumental task of creating a dedicated AIDS ward at San Francisco General Hospital.
Yeah.
What would become known as Ward 5B. Now, this was a radical idea at the time. Most hospitals were trying to isolate AIDS patients, but Morrison envisioned a space where they could receive specialized care without judgment, without fear.
It was a revolutionary concept, and it went against the prevailing medical and social attitudes towards AIDS. Remember, this was a time when many healthcare workers were afraid to even touch AIDS patients, let alone provide them with compassionate care.
But Morrison was determined. He was determined to create a different kind of space, one where patients were treated with dignity and respect. But getting Ward 5B off the ground wasn't easy. He faced resistance from colleagues, skepticism from administrators, and a constant battle for funding.
And he had to navigate a complex web of political and social anxieties. The Reagan administration was notoriously slow to respond to the AIDS crisis, and there was a lot of fear and misinformation circulating about how the disease was spread.
But Morris persevered. He secured funding from San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein, who showed remarkable leadership by supporting this initiative despite the political risks involved.
Feinstein's support was crucial. She understood the urgency of the situation and recognized the need for a humane and compassionate response to the epidemic.
And then came the challenge of staffing Ward 5B. Morrison needed nurses and doctors who were not only skilled but also willing to put aside their fears and prejudices to provide truly compassionate care.
This was a tall order. Remember, the stigma surrounding AIDS was so strong that many healthcare professionals were reluctant to work with these patients.
But Morrison was incredibly honest with potential staff about the risks and challenges involved. He didn't sugarcoat the situation, but instead emphasized the importance of their work, the profound impact they could have on the lives of these patients. And to his surprise, many healthcare professionals were drawn to this mission of compassion and service.
He appealed to their sense of humanity, their desire to make a difference in the midst of a crisis. And he fostered a culture of honesty and openness, encouraging staff to share their fears and concerns without judgment.
And that's what made Ward 5B so unique. It wasn't just about medical care. It was about creating a community of support for patients who had been ostracized and abandoned by society.
Exactly. They instituted policies that focused on patient dignity and empowerment. They allowed visitors anytime, day or night, including chosen family and even pets. They prioritize patient comfort and autonomy, involving them in decisions about their care, and encouraging open communication.
And they challenged the prevailing norms about personal protective equipment. Instead of suiting up in head-to-toe gear, they used common sense precautions, emphasizing the power of human touch and connection.
This was a huge departure from the fear-based approach, that was so prevalent at the time. They recognized that AIDS wasn't transmitted through casual contact,
Yeah.
and that the benefits of human touch far outweighed the perceived risks.
And they were right. Not a single staff member at Ward 5B contracted HIV from a patient. Their compassionate approach not only provided comfort and dignity to those dying from AIDS, but also helped to dispel the myths and misconceptions surrounding the disease.
They were truly pioneers, demonstrating that it was possible to provide high-quality care to AIDS patients without sacrificing compassion or putting healthcare workers at undue risk. And their work had a ripple effect, influencing healthcare practices and policies around the world.
Ward 5B became a model for compassionate AIDS care, showing that it was possible to treat patients with dignity and respect, even in the face of a deadly and stigmatized disease.
Yeah.
But let's not forget the emotional toll this work took on the staff at Ward 5B. They witnessed immense suffering and loss, and many experienced burnout, compassion fatigue, and even PTSD.
Absolutely. Caring for dying patients, especially under those circumstances, was incredibly demanding and emotionally draining.
And yet they continued to show up day after day, offering comfort, support, and a listening ear to those who needed it most.
It speaks to their resilience, their unwavering commitment to their patients, and their deep well of compassion.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always room for hope and humanity. Now, as we reflect on the stories of Medgar Evers and Cliff Morrison, I keep coming back to this question: what can we learn from these individuals? How can we apply their courage and compassion to the challenges we face today?
That's a great question. I think it's important to remember that we may not be facing the same overt forms of racism and homophobia that Medgar Evers and Cliff Morrison encountered, but injustice and inequality, well, they still exist. They still exist in many forms.
Right. We see it in the systemic racism that
Mm.
continues to plague our justice system,
Mm.
in the healthcare disparities that leave marginalized communities vulnerable,
Yeah.
in the attacks on LGBTQ plus rights.
Exactly. And I think both Evers and Morrison demonstrate the power of individual action,
Mm.
of refusing to be silent or complacent in the face of suffering. They remind us that change doesn't happen overnight. It requires sustained effort, unwavering commitment, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Medgar Evers, he dedicated his life to fighting for racial equality, even when it meant putting his own life on the line.
Yeah.
And Cliff Morrison created a space of safety and dignity for those who were shunned by society, challenging the stigma surrounding AIDS, and advocating for compassionate care.
They both understood that silence and inaction are not options in the face of injustice and suffering. They chose to be voices for the voiceless and to use their skills and positions to make a tangible difference.
And their stories, they highlight the importance of empathy and understanding. Evers fought for a world where Black people were treated with dignity and respect, where they had equal opportunities and access to justice. And Morrison, he demonstrated that compassion and care can transform lives, even in the face of a devastating illness.
They both remind us that progress requires seeing beyond ourselves, recognizing the humanity in others, and extending compassion to those who are different from us.
I'm struck by Cliff Morrison's quote, I was a gay man, but I was a nurse first.
Yeah.
It speaks to his unwavering commitment to his patients, his willingness to put their needs before his own. He recognized that our shared humanity transcends our differences.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have multiple identities, and those identities can intersect in complex ways. But ultimately, our shared humanity should guide our actions and interactions.
So where do we go? Where do we go from here? How do we channel the spirit of Medgar Evers and Cliff Morrison in our own lives?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing our own spheres of influence, whether it's in our families, workplaces, or communities. We can use our voices and actions to promote justice, equity, and compassion.
We can listen to those who are marginalized and amplify their voices. We can educate ourselves about the the systemic injustices that persist in our society and work to dismantle them.
And we can challenge our own biases and be willing to learn and grow. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in building a more just and compassionate world.
Even small acts of kindness and bravery can have a ripple effect, creating positive change and inspiring others to do the same. And as we've seen with both Medgar Evers and Cliff Morrison, those individual actions can sometimes spark movements and transform systems.
Their legacies, they remind us that we are not powerless, that we can make a difference. We can honor their memory by carrying their spirit of courage, compassion, and justice forward in our own lives.
It's a powerful message, and one that I hope stays with all of you long after this deep dive. We encourage you to explore the source material. We've linked it in the show notes. There are books, documentaries, articles that offer deeper insights into the lives and legacies of Medgar Evers and Cliff Morrison.
And as always, we want to thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope you'll subscribe to the deep dive for more insightful explorations of the people, the events, and the ideas that shape our world.
That's it for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a little bit brighter, a little bit kinder, and a little bit more just.